For more than 500 years, one line written into Spanish royal law was assumed to have worked exactly as intended. In 1492, the same year Spain funded Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, the Spanish crown ordered every Jew in the kingdom to either convert to Christianity or leave the country entirely. Those who converted were called conversos, and Spanish law specifically barred them, along with their descendants, from ever emigrating to the new Spanish colonies being carved out across the Americas, a restriction backed by the full institutional weight of the Inquisition and enforced, at least on paper, for centuries afterward. For 5 centuries, that ban was treated as historical fact, a closed door nobody seriously questioned, repeated in history books and colonial archives as simply one settled detail among many describing how the Spanish Empire tried to control who was allowed to cross the Atlantic and settle its new territories. Then geneticists compared DNA collected across Latin America against reference populations from Spain and the wider Mediterranean, and found that door had been quietly propped open the entire time, its trace still written into the genomes of millions of people who had no idea it was there. To understand why that finding landed as such a shock, it helps to start with the story most people already accept about where Latin American ancestry comes from. Historical records and decades of prior genetic research consistently describe the population of modern Latin America as the product of 3 broad ancestral streams meeting and mixing following Spanish colonization, beginning in the late 15th century. Native American populations, who had already lived across the continent for tens of thousands of years. European colonizers, overwhelmingly Spanish and Portuguese, arriving from the late 1400s onward. And enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, forcibly transported across the Atlantic in vast numbers from the 16th century through the 19th. That 3-way admixture story is not wrong. It is well documented, extensively studied, and broadly confirmed by every major genetic survey of the region, conducted over the past several decades. What a newer, far more detailed genetic analysis revealed is that this tidy 3-part story was missing an entire additional thread, one deliberately hidden by the very people who carried it, for reasons that made perfect sense at the time and stayed largely invisible for the 5 centuries that followed. The story of that hidden thread begins with the same year that opens this entire chapter of history. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who had just completed the centuries-long Reconquista, the gradual Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from centuries of Muslim rule, and funded Columbus's first voyage that same year, issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Catholicism. Estimates of how many Jews left Spain rather than convert vary considerably across historical sources, ranging anywhere from tens of thousands to several 100,000 people scattering across North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other parts of Europe, while a substantial number, likely in the tens of thousands, chose conversion instead, becoming what Spanish society called conversos, a term simply meaning converts, though the community itself is also referred to in Hebrew as anusim, meaning those who were forced. This was, by any measure, one of the largest forced religious displacements in early modern European history, and it left the newly converted population in an uncomfortable, precarious social position, formally Christian but permanently suspect in the eyes of much of Spanish society around them. Converts and their descendants remained under intense and often violent suspicion for generations. Since the Spanish Inquisition, formally established in 1478 and expanded significantly in the years following the expulsion, existed specifically to investigate whether conversos were secretly continuing to practice Judaism behind a Catholic public face. Inquisition tribunals operated across Spain and its territories for centuries, employing networks of informants, public trials known as autos da fe, and, in the most severe confirmed cases, execution by burning, creating an atmosphere of pervasive fear that shaped converso family life for generations after the initial conversions took place. Some conversos genuinely abandoned Jewish practice entirely and assimilated fully into Catholic Spanish society within a generation or two, marrying into old Christian families and leaving little visible trace of their origins beyond a surname or two that later genealogists would eventually flag as historically significant. Others, quietly and at enormous personal risk, continued observing Jewish traditions in secret, a phenomenon historians call crypto-Judaism, passed down carefully within families for generations under constant threat of discovery, torture, and execution if the Inquisition ever found evidence against them, sometimes preserving fragments of ritual practice, dietary custom, or private prayer stripped of any outward religious context that might give them away to a suspicious neighbor. Spanish colonial law treated this population as a specific, ongoing security risk when it came time to settle the newly claimed territories across the Atlantic. Official decrees explicitly barred conversos, and in many formulations their direct descendants as well, from legally emigrating to Spain's American colonies, out of concern that unconverted or secretly practicing Jews might undermine the religious uniformity the Crown was determined to establish in the New World. This was not a minor bureaucratic footnote. It was an actively enforced policy, backed by the same institutional machinery of the Inquisition that policed religious conformity within Spain itself, with colonial administrators expected to screen prospective immigrants and turn away anyone whose family background raised suspicion. For 500 years, historians studying Spanish colonization generally treated this restriction as reasonably effective, acknowledging that some individual conversos undoubtedly slipped through using false documentation or bribery, but assuming the overall numbers involved were small, a handful of individual cases rather than anything resembling a sustained, large-scale migration. That assumption is exactly what a landmark genetic study published in 2018 in the journal Nature Communications set out to test directly, using tools far more sensitive than anything available to earlier researchers working on this question. The study, led by geneticist Juan Camilo Chacon Duque, alongside senior researchers Garrett Hellenthal at University College London and Andres Ruiz Linares, analyzed genetic data from more than 6,500 individuals across 5 Latin American countries, drawing volunteers from Porto Alegre in Brazil, Arica in Chile, Medellin in Colombia, Mexico City in Mexico, and Lima in Peru, part of a long-running research effort called the Candela Project, specifically designed to map genetic diversity across Latin America in far finer detail than previous studies had managed, coordinated across dozens of collaborating institutions throughout the region. Rather than relying on older methods that simply estimate broad ancestry percentages, roughly this much European, roughly this much Native American, roughly this much African, the team developed and applied a newer haplotype-based approach, a technique capable of identifying much smaller, more specific shared segments of DNA passed down from particular subpopulations, allowing researchers to distinguish, for the first time at this scale, a genuinely Sephardic or broader South and East Mediterranean genetic signal from ordinary generic Spanish or Portuguese ancestry, a distinction earlier cruder ancestry estimation techniques simply lacked the resolution to make with any real confidence. What the team found did not fit the assumption of a small, marginal number of conversos slipping through colonial restrictions. Across the more than 6,500 individuals sampled, roughly 23% showed a detectable genetic signal, accounting for more than 5% of their total ancestry, linked specifically to Sephardic, South Mediterranean, or East Mediterranean populations, a pattern the researchers concluded most plausibly reflects descent from conversos, who migrated to Spanish America during the colonial period, despite the explicit legal prohibition against exactly that. At the level of individual countries, this Mediterranean-linked ancestry averaged out to a comparatively modest proportion of each population's overall genetic makeup, ranging from roughly 1% in Brazil up to around 4% in Chile, figures that on their own might look unremarkable, easy to dismiss as statistical noise rather than a meaningful historical pattern. But the sheer breadth of that signal, showing up in nearly a quarter of everyone, sampled across 5 separate countries spanning the length of a continent, from tropical Brazil to the arid Chilean north, told a very different story than a handful of individual families quietly evading the rules. It described a migration substantial enough and sustained enough across generations to leave a measurable genetic fingerprint across the entire region, one hiding in plain sight inside a population whose official colonial-era documentation never should have permitted it to exist at all. It is worth pausing on exactly why this specific genetic signal is so difficult to fake or misattribute, because the strength of the finding depends heavily on the precision of the method behind it, and that precision is part of what makes this study meaningfully different from earlier, less conclusive attempts to investigate the same historical question. This detail helps explain something that occasionally surprises people, encountering Mexican and broader Latin American genetic ancestry for the first time, that the European component of that ancestry does not simply read as generically Spanish in some undifferentiated sense, but traces back with real specificity to particular regions of Spain, regions that supplied conquistadors, colonial administrators, farmers, and settlers, in numbers considerably out of proportion to their share of Spain's total population at the time. A Mexican or broader Latin American person tracing their European ancestry today is, in a very real genetic sense, more likely tracing it to a comparatively small, specific corner of southwestern Spain than to the country as an undifferentiated whole, a level of geographic precision that written colonial records alone, without the benefit of modern genetic comparison, would have been considerably harder to establish with this much confidence. Taken together, this body of research reshapes the standard, simplified account of Mexican and broader Latin American ancestry considerably. It is not simply Native American plus generic European plus African, 3 broad, undifferentiated streams meeting in roughly equal, well-documented proportions, exactly as colonial records describe. It includes a specific, geographically concentrated regional Spanish source population, layered with a genuinely hidden thread of Sephardic Jewish ancestry that colonial law explicitly tried, and quietly failed, to prevent from ever crossing the Atlantic at all, surviving instead in secret for generations before eventually blending, largely unnoticed, into the wider mestizo population that Mexico and much of Latin America identifies with today. It is worth being precise about what this research does and does not establish, since a finding framed around hidden ancestry and forbidden migration is exactly the kind of story that tends to get oversimplified once it spreads beyond the original academic paper and into wider public conversation. What is well supported, based on the Candela study's large sample size and its careful, haplotype-based methodology, is that a genuine widespread genetic signal linked to Sephardic and broader South and East Mediterranean populations exists across modern Latin America, appearing in a meaningful proportion of the more than 6,500 individuals sampled across 5 countries, at a scale considerably larger than the historical record of officially sanctioned Jewish emigration to the Spanish colonies would predict on its own, a mismatch between documented law and biological reality, substantial enough that the researchers themselves felt confident describing it as widespread rather than marginal. It is also well supported that specific documented historical settlements, including Monterrey under Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva, provide a genuine, traceable historical mechanism explaining exactly how and why this ancestry became concentrated in specific regions, matching the geographic pattern the genetic data independently reveals, a convergence between 2 completely separate kinds of historical evidence, written archival record and modern population genetics, that considerably strengthens confidence in both. And it is well supported that this ancestral signal continues to show measurable, clinically relevant effects in some modern populations, as demonstrated by research connecting converso-linked paternal lineages to prostate cancer risk patterns among Mexican men today, a finding that moves this entire subject well beyond pure historical curiosity, into an area with genuine present-day medical relevance. What researchers involved in this work have been careful to state clearly is that this finding should not be overstated or oversimplified into a claim that a full quarter of all Latin Americans are secretly Jewish in any meaningful cultural or religious sense. A distinction that matters enormously, given how easily a statistic like this can be flattened into a much bigger, much less accurate claim once it starts circulating outside its original scientific context. Chacon-Duc himself, discussing the findings publicly after publication, emphasized that the 23% figure describes the proportion of the specific sample studied showing a detectable signal above a defined statistical threshold, not a direct one-to-one estimate applicable to the entire population of Latin America, and that the roughly 6,900 person Candela sample, while unusually large and detailed for this kind of research, still carries inherent sampling biases tied to exactly which cities and which volunteers happen to be recruited, and cannot be treated as a perfectly representative cross-section of every community across such an enormous, genetically diverse region stretching from northern Mexico to southern Chile. The precise line between genuine Sephardic-specific ancestry and broader, more generic South or East Mediterranean ancestry unrelated to Jewish history specifically also remains somewhat difficult to draw with total certainty, even using the improved haplotype methods this study applied, since populations across the Mediterranean basin share deep, overlapping genetic history extending back thousands of years before the events of 1492 ever occurred, meaning some portion of the detected signal could, in individual cases, reflect older, unrelated Mediterranean genetic connections, rather than converso ancestry specifically, a nuance the original research paper itself acknowledges rather than glosses over. And the 2024 Columbus Remains investigation, while a genuinely striking and well-publicized finding in its own right, has not yet been subjected to the same level of open, peer-reviewed scientific publication and independent verification that the broader Candela research has undergone, meaning it should currently be treated as a compelling but less rigorously established claim relative to the core nature communication study this entire picture ultimately rests on. What makes this story worth sitting with is not simply that a 500-year-old immigration law turns out to have been widely circumvented, interesting as that fact is on its own. It is what that circumvention says about how thoroughly a hidden identity can be carried forward across centuries, through fear, secrecy, and eventually near total forgetting, without ever fully disappearing from the body that carried it. Families who left Spain or converted and stayed, and then broke an explicit royal prohibition to reach the Americas anyway, were not making some abstract historical decision destined for a research paper 500 years later. They were making an immediate, practical choice about survival, about escaping an Inquisition that could not always be outrun even at the far edge of a newly colonized continent, as the Carvajal family's own fate in Nuevo Leon makes painfully clear. Carrying a secret, many of them likely stopped telling their own children within a generation or two, simply because the safest way to protect a secret that dangerous was eventually to let it become genuinely forgotten rather than merely hidden, a strategy that protected the living at the cost of erasing the story for everyone who came after them. And yet, forgotten or not, deliberately buried under generations of assimilation and silence, that ancestry never actually disappeared. It sat quietly inside DNA passed from parent to child, generation after generation, through the entire span of Mexican, Chilean, Colombian, Peruvian, and Brazilian history that followed, invisible to written records, invisible to family memory in most cases, and completely undetectable using the genetic tools available to researchers for most of the 20th century, until a sufficiently large, sufficiently detailed comparison against the right reference populations finally read it back out more than 500 years after it was first written in. Millions of people across Latin America today are, in a very literal sense, walking around carrying the genetic signature of an act of quiet defiance their ancestors committed against a royal decree centuries ago, without a single one of them ever being told it happened at all. That is, in the end, what this comparison between Mexican, broader Latin American, and Spanish DNA actually reveals. Not a simple confirmation of the well-known conquest and colonization story most people already understand, the version taught in most history classes and repeated in most popular accounts of the period, but a second, quieter migration running directly underneath it, one that official law spent centuries insisting had never happened at all, enforced by an institution willing to torture and kill people to make sure it stayed that way, and one that DNA, patient and indifferent to which version of a history anyone preferred to believe, finally proved wrong nearly 500 years after the fact, using nothing more than careful mathematics applied to the genomes of thousands of ordinary unsuspecting volunteers who had simply agreed to take part in a research study about their own ancestry. If a legal ban written 500 years ago could be this thoroughly defied without leaving a trace anyone could find until modern genetics finally caught up to it, it raises a genuinely interesting question about how many other officially recorded histories, confidently repeated for centuries in textbooks and archives, are hiding a second, uncounted migration of their own, waiting only for the right genetic comparison to finally bring it to light. Every colonial power kept records designed to describe the population it believed it was creating, not necessarily the population it actually created. And the gap between those two things, as this particular case shows, can survive quietly for centuries before anyone has the tools to measure it. Which other country's colonial-era history do you think deserves this same kind of genetic double-check? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see what other hidden migrations turn up as more of these detailed genetic surveys get run around the world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what they uncover next. Ordinary Spanish and Portuguese ancestry and Sephardic Jewish ancestry share a great deal of underlying genetic similarity, both having deep roots in the same Iberian Peninsula stretching back thousands of years before any of this colonial history began, which is exactly why older, cruder ancestry estimation methods struggle to tell the two populations apart at all, often lumping Sephardic-linked signalinda with generic Southern European ancestry and missing the distinction entirely. The haplotype-based technique the Candela team applied instead looks for specific, small combinations of genetic markers, inherited together as a block across many generations, rather than individually, that occur at meaningfully higher frequency within known Sephardic and broader Mediterranean reference populations than they do within general Iberian populations as a whole, a signal subtle enough that it required both a very large, carefully genotyped modern comparison dataset built from populations with well-documented, independently verified ancestry, and a computationally intensive statistical method to detect reliably across thousands of individual genomes. That level of precision is part of why this specific finding, rather than simply confirming what everyone already assumed about Spanish colonial ancestry, actually revealed something historians, using written records alone, had never been able to fully establish: a gap between documentary history and biological reality that older genetic techniques simply were not sensitive enough to expose. The human story behind these numbers becomes considerably more vivid once you connect the genetic pattern to specific documented historical figures rather than treating it as an abstract statistical trend. One of the clearest examples sits in what is now northeastern Mexico, in the modern state of Nuevo Leon, home to the city of Monterrey. Monterrey was founded in 1596 by Luis Carvajal y de la Cueva, a colonial governor granted extensive authority over a vast stretch of northern frontier territory by the Spanish crown, who was himself a converso, and who is documented to have brought numerous converso and crypto-Jewish families along with him to help settle this remote northern frontier region, a stretch of territory deliberately chosen for its distance from the more heavily monitored population centers of central Mexico, where the Inquisition maintained a far more active and effective presence closer to the seat of colonial administration in Mexico City. The logic was straightforward, even if dangerous. The further a community settled from the institutions actively searching for exactly this kind of hidden religious practice, the longer it might realistically survive undiscovered. Carvajal's own family history illustrates exactly how dangerous this life remained, even at a safe geographic distance, and how thin the margin of safety actually was. Several members of his extended family were eventually investigated, tried, and, in some documented cases, executed by the Inquisition after being accused of secretly practicing Judaism, including relatives put on trial in Mexico City itself decades after the initial settlement of Nuevo León. A stark reminder that even choosing the most remote available frontier did not guarantee permanent safety, from the same institutional suspicion that had driven these families out of central Spain in the first place. Carvajal himself was eventually stripped of his position and died in prison after facing his own Inquisition proceedings, a fate that underscores just how precarious this entire arrangement remained, even for the colonial official who had engineered it. Genetic surveys of the modern population in Nuevo León and the surrounding states of Coahuila and Tamaulipas today show a correspondingly elevated concentration of this same Sephardic-linked genetic signal, a pattern that lines up closely with the documented settlement history of exactly the families Carvajal is known to have led into the region more than 4 centuries ago, a case where written historical record and modern genetic data independently converge on the same conclusion from 2 completely different directions. This is not simply a piece of historical trivia with no bearing on the present, a curiosity confined entirely to genealogy enthusiasts and academic historians. A more recent genetic study focused specifically on Y chromosome lineages, the genetic material passed down exclusively along the direct paternal line among Mexican men found a measurable association between certain converso-linked paternal lineages and elevated rates of prostate cancer, describing what researchers termed a possible founder effect, a pattern where a genetic variant carried by a comparatively small founding population becomes disproportionately common among that population's many descendants centuries later, simply through the ordinary mathematics of inheritance repeating itself across dozens of generations without any deliberate selection pressure required. The same basic pattern, a rare variant carried by a small founding group becoming unexpectedly common in a much larger descendant population, purely through the arithmetic of repeated inheritance, shows up in founder populations studied all over the world, and its appearance here provides yet another independent line of evidence supporting the broader converso migration story, arriving this time from the completely separate direction of clinical medicine rather than historical population genetics. Ancestry, that began as a matter of survival and secrecy in the 16th century, in other words, continues to show up in measurable, clinically relevant ways in the health of Mexican men alive today. A genuinely direct line connecting a 500-year-old migration to 21st century medicine, and a reminder that population history is never purely academic, since it continues to shape real health outcomes for real people living many centuries after the original migration took place. The story reaches even further back, connecting directly to the man whose famous 1492 voyage set this entire chapter of history in motion in the first place. In 2024, a Spanish research team led by forensic scientist Miguel Lorente concluded a 22-year investigation into the remains long attributed to Christopher Columbus, interred at the Seville Cathedral in southern Spain, comparing DNA recovered from those remains against DNA from Columbus's documented son, Hernando Colón, and against known living relatives and descendants tracked down across multiple countries over the course of the decades-long project. Announced through a documentary produced for Spain's national broadcaster TVE, titled Columbus DNA, The True Origin, the team reported finding genetic markers present in both the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA lineages examined, described as compatible with Jewish origin, adding fresh scientific weight to a theory about Columbus's ancestry that historians had debated for generations, based purely on circumstantial biographical evidence, including gaps and inconsistencies in the documented record of his early life in Genoa. It is worth being careful about exactly how much weight this specific finding can bear, since it draws on partial, degraded historical remains recovered from a centuries-old tomb and was presented through a television documentary rather than a fully published, peer-reviewed academic paper subjected to the same open scrutiny as the Candela research discussed above. Forensic genetic analysis of remains this old carries inherent technical challenges, including the risk of contamination and the difficulty of extracting sufficiently intact genetic material after 5 centuries in a stone tomb. Challenges the research team has stated they worked carefully to account for, but which, nonetheless, mean the finding has not yet undergone the same kind of independent academic replication that a standard journal publication would require before the wider scientific community treats it as fully settled. But taken together with the broader pattern the 2018 Nature Communication study documented across millions of ordinary descendants scattered across an entire continent, it adds a genuinely striking historical bookend to the overall picture, suggesting that Sephardic ancestry may sit not only scattered anonymously across the modern Latin American population, but potentially at the very origin point of the voyage that first connected Spain to the Americas. Alongside the specifically Sephardic thread, broader genetic and historical analysis of Spanish colonial immigration has pointed toward another layer of regional specificity worth understanding, this one concerning ordinary, non-converso Spanish settlers as well, and helping fill out the fuller picture of exactly which parts of Spain sent the people who became the ancestors of modern Latin America. Historical immigration records from the Spanish colonial period indicate that the regions of Extremadura and Andalusia, in the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, supplied a disproportionately large share, by some estimates as much as 60 to 70%, of the Spanish emigrants who actually made the crossing to the Americas during the colonial era, a pattern broadly consistent with genetic ancestry modeling that finds these two southwestern Spanish regions provide the closest fit when researchers attempt to trace the specific European source populations underlying modern Latin American ancestry. This is not entirely surprising once you consider the practical logistics of colonial immigration during this period. Southwestern Spain sat closest to the major ports, particularly Seville, that controlled and monopolized trade and travel to the Americas for much of the colonial era, meaning people from this specific corner of the country simply had the shortest, most practical route to the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, while immigrants from more distant Spanish regions faced a considerably longer and more expensive overland journey before they ever reached a port at all. Now, this detail helps explain something that occasionally surprises people encountering Mexican and broader Latin American genetic ancestry for the first time, that the European component of that ancestry does not simply read as generically Spanish in some undifferentiated sense, but traces back with real specificity to particular regions of Spain, regions that supplied conquistadors, colonial administrators, farmers, and settlers, in numbers considerably out of